Let's start just with the West Bank. Apartheid, I think, generally means a kind of legal supremacy by one racial, ethnic, religious group over another. Isn't that clearly the situation in the West Bank? All the Jews who live, all the Israeli Jews in the West Bank have full citizenship under civil law, free movement. They can vote for the government that controls their lives. None of the Palestinians have those rights, even as you know, and better than me, right? It's true that under the Oslo process you have areas A, B, and C, but there's no Palestinian army. The Israeli army can go into area A and B and be into the home of any Palestinian it wants anywhere on the West Bank anytime it wants, and none of those Palestinians have citizenship vis-a-vis the state that has basically life and death control over them. So why isn't it apartheid in the West Bank?
But you apply it everywhere, don't you? And the
Well, but
groups you
let's start with
cited
the West
apply it
Bank.
everywhere,
I mean,
right?
but would you could, but I understand, but would you concede at least that it's apartheid in the West Bank?
I don't apply that term to it. I describe I agree there are inequalities, and I agree there must be a separation, and I agree that has been and should be remain the focus of U.S. policy to create that separation. Even President Trump, who obviously I don't have much good to say about on most subjects, including this one for the most part, but in his 2020 plan, weak as it was, bad as it was, it included 70% of the West Bank to be ruled by Palestinians, self-ruled. Even now, in his 20-point plan issued last October, it includes at least a call for a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. That's exactly what should happen as a result of a negotiation, as a result of the Israeli control of that territory, which resulted from a war in 1967. Many of the problems you described are accurate. I don't think that term needs to be applied to it, and I'd much rather focus on what the solution should be to it.
Okay, but just one more question about why the resistance to using the term? I mean, it is a term in international law, and so why should we be if you accept the fact pattern that which is two groups of people living in the same space, one with
Yeah,
full legal rights, why isn't that apartheid?
it's an occupation that can't be sustained long term, and ultimately can only be resolved through a negotiation and a separation. Obviously, I've said for you know decades now to Israelis, if Israel is going to remain Jewish and democratic, it's going to have to relinquish much of that territory, if not most all of it. Certainly, the people living in it who are entitled to self-determination. And obviously, over time, yes, you can't have that entire area remain Jewish and democratic if that separation does not occur. So that to me is, I think, an adequate description of the situation.
So you just used the term Jewish and democratic, and I wanted to ask you about that. I think if Donald Trump were to announce tomorrow that he was declaring America to be a Christian and democratic state, you and I would both probably say, we actually think these things are contradictory. We don't believe that we as non-Christians could be equal under the law in a Christian and democratic state. So how could a Jewish and democratic state actually ever treat people who weren't Jews equally? Isn't there a basic contradiction between liberal democracy, which means equality under the law, irrespective of your religion, race, and ethnicity, and the idea that you have a superior legal obligation to members of one religious or ethnic group?
Look, Peter, I mean, if you're going to take the position that the only way this can be ever resolved or dealt with is the elimination of a Jewish state of Israel, even one that provides full legal and civil rights to its minority populations
But I'm saying it can't.
in a
That's my
stable
very point,
in
is
a
that it
stable
can't do
Jewish
both.
majority. It does do that in Israel of 1967.
It gives
And
Palestinian citizens equal rights?
they have full civil rights as citizens of that democracy, and it is possible to be Jewish and democratic with a stable Jewish majority. Now, it's different model than the United States. Yes, it's not you can't exactly map one democratic system onto the other, but that I think is a perfectly legitimate and acceptable and necessary situation, a Jewish and democratic state that provides those rights to its minority citizens. But in order to sustain it, yes, it does have to have a Jewish majority population. That's why holding those other territories with the other Palestinian populations is ultimately detrimental to Israel's own interest. But I mean, look, we're going into this area where if you're proposal is
Yeah.
that the way to make some progress toward resolving this is
Mhm.
that the people of Israel, who many of them the descendants of refugees, of Holocaust survivors, of people who, through all of the tragedies of Jewish history, culminating in the Holocaust, came to understand that Jewish self-determination in the historic homeland of the Jewish people was the way to ensure that the Jewish people survive. I believe me, you're not going to get anywhere, right? Hang on, there's no chance
Okay.
that this polity is going to voluntarily dismantle itself to meet some kind of academic standard that you're bringing about what makes something a legitimate democracy. When you can do it in the Jewish democratic model that Israel was founded to be and is still within its original borders.
Well, I don't think the principle of equality under the law is academic. I mean, this language of trying to maintain a demographic majority, when we hear it from Tucker Carlson in the United States, or when you hear it from parties on the far right in Europe, I think you and I are genuinely fundamentally opposed to this. We don't believe in the idea, certainly I don't, and I would imagine you don't in most places other than Israel, maybe every place other than Israel. You don't believe that countries should have different tiers of citizens, one whose demographic weight is more important. So if a Palestinian kid is born in Haifa, oh my goodness, that means that the Jewish demographic majority might go down by a percentage point. That just seems to me fundamentally different from the kind of attitude that we have about what we believe is right in our country.
Again, what goes on in our country and what goes on in the Middle East are not easily mapped one onto the other, and that's just not a reasonable way to address the realities of that part of the world. I don't think it's a reasonable way to address the realities of Jewish history either, and the need for Jewish sovereignty and self-determination after centuries of exile and centuries of persecution as well. Um, so but that's at the sort of philosophical level. I'm talking about the practical level. If you want to see any better future for Israelis and Palestinians, what you're going in proposition is that the very existence of a Jewish state of Israel, Jewish and democratic, I will hold to that description. You don't accept it, fire, but that's just a disagreement between us. But if that very existence of that entity is fundamentally either unjust or needs to be changed, what you are actually advocating for is something that leads to endless conflict, endless war. There's no way that Jewish state of Israel and the population that believes in its existence, and I strongly agree with them, are going to voluntarily dismantle it. They're just not. And so if that's the demand, you will have endless conflict. There's no other way around it.
No, I mean it's true. I mean we could have said the same about white South Africans who also were vehemently opposed to moving away from a system of supremacy, right? I think it's very or Protestants in Northern Ireland vehemently opposed, or white American Southerners. It's typical for people who have a form of legal supremacy to believe very strongly that it preserves their safety. But one of the things that's striking to
But
me is that
your position, I know, Peter, because I've read your
yeah,
books
yeah,
and read
yeah.
your position is that there is no justification or no justice in a Jewish state of Israel whatsoever. I obviously fundamentally disagree with that, and
Right,
almost
right.
all Israelis fundamentally disagree with that. So
Almost all
good
Jewish
luck.
Israelis. Almost all Jewish
Yes.
Israelis, because actually it's funny. Like part of the reason that I mean, the idea that I have, right, of a state for all its citizens, let's say, right, was actually proposed by a bunch of the Palestinian members of the Knesset in 2018. They said we would like they're Israelis. They said we would like this country to be a country that treats everybody equally under the law, irrespective of race, religion, and ethnicity, right? And that seems and it seems to me, actually, I would argue that I actually think that's
These
safer
are
for everybody.
elected members of the Knesset, you point out,
They were
right?
elected, but they didn't think of
Not
them.
characteristic of an apartheid system, by the way,
Well,
right?
most of the Palestinians under Israeli control, unfortunately, don't get to vote in Israeli elections. These are
No,
the minorities who do.
you're making the argument that the fundamental existence of a Jewish and democratic state is impossible, or a
Well,
fundamental existence of a Jewish state is unethical, and it's undermined by the fact that these Arab members of Knesset are elected and take part in governance in that
No,
country.
because I mean, look,
And look, by the way, we are a democracy with flaws. We have democracy. Obviously, we had slavery for over a
right,
century
right,
or nearly a
right.
century of the beginning. We, long after slavery was abolished, we have deep inequities and with minorities in our population. We are far from a perfect example of how minorities should experience life in a democracy. It's different. These are different systems, different cultures, different regions, different histories. You can't map one onto the other. But to say that those Arab citizens who are elected to their parliament don't have those equal rights, that's just not correct.
But that was what they were saying. I mean, the reason they proposed a basic law on equality to say there should not be discrimination
There
based
should
on it
not be
was
discrimination.
precisely legal discrimination, right? Was precisely because although they can be elected, I mean, look, a black American in New York City was able to be elected to Congress in the 1920s. It didn't mean black Americans were equal under the law in New York. Right. So the point is they saw themselves as every Palestinian citizen that I've basically ever met saw themselves as second class citizens. And they didn't want to be second class citizens any more than you or I would want to be second class citizens. They wanted to be equal citizens. And so I guess it seems to me the question is, why can't we imagine a country that provides Palestinians equal citizenship to Israeli Jews? I actually happen to think, again, I know many people think I'm crazy, that it's actually safer for everybody when everybody has equality under the law, when everyone is equally represented in government without these caste systems based on religion or ethnicity or race. Go ahead.
I'm just not accepting these terms you're throwing around about not lack of equality under the law for
Do
Arab
you
citizens of
you
Israel
don't
or
think you think they
caste
have equality under
systems.
the law in Israel? Israel
I think they
proper.
do. Yes, I do. And
What
I
about
think
go ahead.
as in many other democracies, there is not full equality in opportunity in resources. That is certainly true in our democracy, our flawed democracy, as it is there, and in many other flawed democracies. Is there room for improvement in that society? Of course. But these descriptions of it, as if to say there's no scenario where you can have a Jewish and democratic state with that minority experiencing its rights fully within that democracy, it's just wrong. But this Peter, this is an interesting academic debate.
It's not
Okay,
an
hang on.
academic debate. This is the
It
debate
is
that
an academic debate.